Thank you everyone for joining me today to explore this somewhat obscure poetic form of the Ghazal. Somewhat obscure because it is well known in Western and South Asian circles. However, their popularity in these settings diminish what these poetic forms have achieved, treating queerness and politics as traits of individual poets or as products of specific movements and nations. My study instead reads the Ghazal as a sustained counter-public dissent, tracing a continuous history of protest rather than isolated and exceptional moments. Before doing this, however, let's start with definitions. The Ghazal, at its simplest, is a love poem. It is among the oldest and most resilient lyric forms in West and South Asia. What unites its many variations is a particular architecture of form and feeling. And this is what an Urdu ghazal would look like on a page. It is read from right to left, and it is composed of autonomous couplets that share a refrain that echoes throughout the poem. Each can stand alone, yet together they reinforce an idea. Rather than building narrative or argument, the ghazal moves through images and moods without resolution, and this repetition gathers force. Here, the refrain is the Urdu word kyun, which could be translated as pain, hurt, torment, depending on how it's used in each verse. The repetition of this word carries the poem's shape and its music. In the original language, that music is clear to the ear and visible to the eye. But translated to English, we see some of those features disappear. And I'm saying this now because a lot of the poems we're going to look at, some of these features are never always clear. In this case, it's the refrain, but each couplet still circles around the same feeling of longing, just more challenging to find. But it is there. No? And in this Ghazal by Mirza Ghalib, the beloved is cast in a different light: tormentor, stranger, infidel, deceased. Each couplet hovering around the same idea of the beloved, bringing some kind of torment or pain through each fragment, culminating in how desire is withheld. The lover, often the poet himself, esteemed yet powerless in love, pleads as their fulfillment is endlessly deferred, allowing longing to become the subject. Over time, the ghazal has solidified into a very popular form. Here, it is a love song performed for audiences hungry for its emotional intensity and lyrical beauty. It is widely beloved in this form, melodious, moving, but it is also treated as largely apolitical. This performance by Hariharan is one example: smooth, musical, deeply emotive, and this is the ghazal that circulates most widely. But the ghazal, I argue, is more than a love poem. Its structure centered around the beloved who never arrives. Um, can be conditioned and expanded to question notions of belonging. Nations, religions, empires all promise intimacy as they force cultures into submission, colonize them, entice them to adopt their religion and language, force the collection of taxes and tributes. But these other cultures are never allowed to participate in shaping their own futures and the societies they are made to inhabit. The Ghazal makes this condition audible. It creates a space where the impossibility of love is transposed to the impossibility of institutions. This is what I call its queerness, not only the queerness of unsanctioned desires, but the queerness of refusing to fit neatly within power's embrace and to settle more specifically into the grand narrative of a unified Arab state. In this sense, the Ghazal becomes a counterpublic that sustains intimacy and dissent in the face of continued exclusion. Michael Warner lends us the framework for thinking about publics and counterpublics. A public is the dominant sphere of circulation, the place where ideas appear to speak for everyone, but in reality carry only the voice of those in power. Unlike other marginal positions whose agency is questioned constantly, a counterpublic gains influence despite exclusion from the center by securing spaces for discourse. They are not passive, and they produce their own forums, performances, and forms to sustain communities that insist on being heard despite their marginality. What distinguishes counterpublics is not simply identity or lifestyle, but discourse sustained through forms like theater, song, and in this case, poetry. Warner builds his idea of the counterpublic out of queer theory, showing how communities form when they are not recognized by the dominant public sphere. Their exclusion is structural, but it is also the ground of creativity. From that estrangement, new spaces of discourse emerge. Here, queerness is not limited to sexuality. It is a social process emanating from when certain lives are continually denied legitimacy. Queerness describes the inequality of living in structures that promise belonging but never deliver it. It is the persistence of voices that survive without sanction, that circulate in indirection, opacity, and refusal. Just exactly what kind of sensibility is the queer Ghazal working against? Consider this poem by Fakhri al-Barudi, a popular anthem of Arab nationalism whose title alone reads like a slogan. Arab's homeland is my country. The poem is protective of a unified and coherent Arab republic, imagined through language, bloodline, and patriarchal ancestry. And that numerous cultures, geographies, faiths, and languages can all be harmonized under the authority of Arabic, whether you are from Baghdad, Yemen, or Egypt. This is precisely the sensibility that the queer Ghazal unsettles. The arrogance of this nationalist voice shows us the stakes, and the queer Ghazal will work against the fantasy of patriarchal coherence. If Al-Barudi insists on coherence, Agha Shahid Ali's Ghazal Arabic insists on fracture. Here, Arabic is not the proud tongue of unity. The Ghazal insists on its absence in moments that its influence was needed the most, claiming the only language of lost left in the world is Arabic. And the poem carries us historically and geographically across the Arab Empire, pointing to different moments and places that have suffered tragedy through the complicit inaction of Arabic. For example, we are taken to the mythical past, to the story of Layla and Majnun, where a man's despairing love for a woman drives him to madness. His Arabic cannot make the love real, hold himself together, or make his feelings understood to the others around him, whom he can only talk to in Arabic. Arabic has not made him coherent. In fact, it has only made him crazy. Arabic has failed him. But the failure of Arabic as lingua franca is not just myth, it is also historical. When the Mughal Empire collapsed under the British, Arabic was a detached language that kept invoking its supremacy in the religious and cultural affairs of the Mughal court. As the Mughal Empire was reduced to artifacts and delicate calligraphy, Arabic was not there to mourn or remember, nor did it offer a political voice against British oppression, much less offer consolation to its believers captured by Christian colonizers. Again, Arabic is absent. In 1948, the Palestinian village of Deir Yassin was destroyed during the Nakba massacre. Where homes once stood, there are now forests. The land remembers, but Arabic is silent, erased from daily speech, replaced by the Hebrew of a new state. Shahid Ali references Palestine's fragile relationship with Israel. And while Arabic could have offered both political diplomacy and solace, it remained indifferent. Despite defending the religion of the Arab world to death, Palestine was crushed, with Arabic remaining silent in this crucial moment. Again, there's no sign of Arabic. If in al-Barudi's poem, the anthem of Arab unity insisted on coherence, one homeland, one tongue, one faith, one people, Shahid Ali's Ghazal refuses that fantasy, insisting on fracture and on multiplicity. After leading us through myth and history, exile and dispossession, Shahid Ali arrives at his own name, Shahid, whose meaning is not singular. In Persian, it is the beloved, and in Arabic, ironically, it is witness. The poet is the one left to articulate the inhabited reality where the official language fails. Between these languages, the self is split, doubled, estranged. And the poet cannot be fully one thing. He must be both, and yet he is neither. And this is the queerness in the Ghazal, not only unsanctioned love, but the impossibility of coherence itself, a name that resists settling, a self claimed by many languages, yet belonging to none. It allows the beloved and the witness to coexist in tension, but never reconcile. And it extends to other contradictions between citizen and homeland, faithful and faith, language and speaker, political collectives, and political disenfranchisement. This is the Ghazal's queer counterpublic, a space where patriarchal coherence yields to the vulnerability of contradiction. The refusal in Agha Shahid Ali's Arabic is not new. It continues a long history where queerness survives in traditions cracks, even when power tries to silence it. When Islamic orthodoxy suppressed sexual queerness, it also constricted space for queer politics. To see this, we begin to return to the Ghazal's beginnings in Arabic poetry. Before coming the lyric of suspended longing, the Ghazal emerged from the Qasida, the great public ode of pre-Islamic Arabia. The Qasida, often over 100 lines, moved from mourning to journey to triumph. Its design sought resolution, pushing grief toward endurance, and affirming a patriarchal masculinity. The Syrian poet Adonis, one of the most influential Arab poets of the 20th century, offers us a compressed version of the Qasida in his short poem, The Wanderer, which goes, A wanderer, I make prayer of dust. Exiled, I sing my soul until the world burns to my chances to a miracle. Thus am I risen, thus I am redeemed. Though brief, the poem echoes the classical Qasidas movement. The first two lines lament exile and loss. The third to the sixth lines echo a journey to discovery while in exile. And the last three lines offers a redemptive, triumphant ending. Many Arab poets resisted the Qasida's drive toward closure, doubting its promises of redemption and progress. The Qasida upheld collective order by restoring tribal unity and affirming masculine authority. Yet many poets unsettled this order as they lingered at the ruins, mourning what could not return. Their lives were marked by precarity, by loss, separation, and the impossibility of building lasting institutions or communities. Even before the Nasib evolved into the Ghazal, the earliest Qasidas already intimated fracture within the patriarchal order. Imru al-Qais's Mu Alaka, the Suspended Ode, is among the most celebrated Arabic poems precisely because its Nasib refines emotion into a form of rebellion. The title refers to the tradition of displaying these odes on the walls of the Kaaba, the most sacred site in Islam at the heart of the Grand Mosque in Mecca. It opens, Stop, remember, weep, for the one I loved in the place we would meet, where the sands thin between Al Dakul and Haumal. The poem interrupts the heroic journey to dwell on loss, unsettling the narrative of conquest and control. Intimacy merges with landscape, turning the ruins into a site of resistance where memory and emotion take precedence over progress. But the poem's seed takes it further, staging tension between public codes of masculinity and private emotion. By permitting men to weep, the Qasida questions the authority it outwardly serves. The poet's tears destabilize the ideal of stoic virility on which tribal power rests, moving from one encampment to another. Desire is scattered and bonds dissolve. What endures is not mastery but loss, a contradiction the Ghazal would later refine into its central logic of longing and estrangement. So when the earliest ghazals appeared in the Umayyad period, like in this one by Umar ibn Abi Rabi'a, a Qurayshi aristocrat in Mecca, the meanderings of love are no longer rewarded. The poem dramatizes a quarrel between lovers and seemingly builds toward fulfillment, but at the crucial moment, the beloved interrupts with words of caution. My cousin, let my soul be your ransom. I fear lest some secret enemy speak and do us wrong. That the lover and beloved are cousins is not the transgression here. These marriages were common as they consolidated power and preserved lineage among prominent families. In a world of desert crossings and shifting encampments, kinship offered some kind of stability. Families bound themselves tightly so that intimacy could survive impermanence. The real danger lies in the exposure of premarital intimacy. For powerful families, reputations depended on moral restraint. And so to be caught yielding to desire before marriage risks scandal, loss of honor, and the collapse of alliances. Public surveillance was merciless, and the beloved voices his fear directly. It is not love itself that is forbidden, but the act of being seen breaking the codes of control. Here, the point's queerness emerges. Love is precarious not only through longing, because in the Umayyad desert, tents could be raised or abandoned overnight, routes closed under threat, and survival depended on fragile arrangements of water, beasts, and kin. This precarity shapes the poem's emotional texture, where the Qasida sought resolution, a journey toward closure. But the Ghazal lingers in what cannot be secured, dwelling in the uncertainty of encampments and crossings where nothing is fixed and everything may vanish in an instant. Abu Nuwas, writing in Abbasid Baghdad, pushes the form further, queering it outright. In this ghazal, the beloved sends him a messenger boy. The lover's desire shifts from the absent beloved to the intermediary who protests, You want to tempt me. When the lover finally meets the beloved, she accuses him of betrayal. You fell in love with my messenger. Both this one and that one will be recorded against you in the book of reckoning. Her judgment frames love as transgression tallied like sin. The lover refuses guilt and answers with scripture, recalling the Quranic story of Joseph, betrayed by his brothers and falsely mourned as mauled by a wolf. By speaking Jacob's disbelief, what you say about him is a lie. He identifies with Joseph, the innocent condemned, and turned scripture against moral authority. Here, queerness lies in the act of reinterpretation. The poem disarms religious and legal judgment, refusing to let desire be cast as sin. Accused yet unrepentant, the lover transforms the Ghazal into a space where forbidden longing speaks and survives beyond the reach of law. The Ghazal's Arabic origins hold both grandeur and defiance. In the Qasida, poetry upheld tribal and patriarchal order, celebrating conquest, lineage, and endurance. Yet within the Nasib, poets lingered in ruins and longing, replacing triumph of vulnerability and impermanence. From the start, the Ghazal resists tribal patriarchy and religious authority. Its queerness lies in deferral, embracing unresolved desire over heroic closure, rejecting promises of reunion or homeland. The seed of refusal flourishes in the Persian verse, gaining spiritual depth and intricate form. If the Arabic ghazal began in the ruins of the Nasib, uh, sorry, if the Arabic ghazal began in the ruins of the Nasib, Persian poets transformed it into a polished, introspective art form. Most features now associated with the genre emerged here. The crucial shift was one of orientation. The Persian ghazal turned from patriarchal prescription toward inner transformation, teaching that truth resides within and that power promises are hollow. Paradox became central. The seeker must be lost to be found, the lover must be broken to know love, and the beloved embodied this ambiguity, unfixed, elusive, mirroring the Sufi belief that truth appears only through change. In Rumi's You Say You Are Not a Seeker, we see a clear delineation of counterpublic positioning as the lover urges the beloved to cross thresholds of transformation. The refrain, with us you will, turns each couplet into a promise of becoming, where the powerful beloved must abandon privilege to enter a counterpublic of mystics and lovers. Justice is imagined through reversal. The voiceless will sing, the rich empty, the powerful undone. Belonging no longer follows law or orthodoxy, but arises from choosing against them, finding joy in solidarity, promising your whole being will laugh like a rose in bloom with us. Unlike the Arabic ghazal, where the beloved stays distant, Rumi draws the beloved into a shared intimacy, into a counter-public us. Fulfillment comes not from private longing, but from collective vulnerability and care. And this is the commune the beloved is invited to, a world remade through hospitality and desire, where artists, prophets, and mystics gather. Where Rumi invited the beloved to cross thresholds of social class, Hafez shows what happens when these thresholds dissolve completely. In If That Shirazi Turk, we no longer stand before the gate of a mystical commune, but we are taken inside a debaucherous tavern. The beloved is not a seeker anymore, but a figure who unsettles every measure of belonging. The poet places affection above empire, surrendering two sacred sites of Persian power, Bokhara and Samarkand, for the beloved small. The Turk embodies the hierarchies of Hafez's world, young, eroticized, and socially subordinate. His beauty is racialized, bound to conquest and servitude. The poem turns history inside out. The Turks, once deemed inferior after failed invasions of West Persia, return here not as conquerors but as desired bodies. This reversal dismantles empire's logic as power becomes an ornament traded for intimacy. The Ghazal reveals how sovereignty relies on repressing longing, on deciding whose love counts as virtue and whose as sin. The tavern also becomes the counterpublic's home. Its air is ungoverned, and when the poet calls "Come, boy," and then pour the wine's last drops, he invites participation in this fugitive space. Heaven, the promised reward of orthodoxy, is dismissed, since heaven's courts will not provide the gardens of Armosalia or Roknabad's green riverside. Paradise is local, embodied, irreverent, belonging to those who live and love outside institutions of faith and rule. Where Rumi sought harmony through transformation, Hafez finds freedom in disorder. His poems gather the displaced, the Shirazi Turk, the gypsy, the cupbearer, whose presence unsettles hierarchy and order. Persian poetry becomes a fellowship of non-conforming identities, unlike Arabic verse, centered on courtesans and elites. More than pleasure, the tavern offers refuge and rebellion. As Ahmad and Hayat write, it inspires resistance to religious orthodoxy and the quest for spiritual freedom. Here, the exiled gypsies, Turks, mystics, wanderers form a small republic where reverence is expressed through wine, song, and friendship. Hafez's lovers and drunks seek no transcendence. Their wisdom lies in laughter, intimacy, and unmoralized desire, inviting us to talk of wine and music and not of faith, dismantling empire and orthodoxy. In the Persian period, the Ghazal becomes more than a love poem. It imagines life otherwise, where longing resists control. Its queerness lies not only in same sex desire, but in its refusal of fixity. Persian poets blur the boundaries enforced by empire and religion, boundaries like man and woman, body and soul, sacred and profane, ruler and servant. And this resistance to clarity is political. By keeping meanings open, the Ghazal imagines freedom as shared uncertainty. Under the Ottomans, the Ghazal entered a world of spectacle. What was once intimate and mystical in Persian poetry was absorbed into imperial performance, recited with music and dance, surviving delicately within excess. Amid the noise, some Ghazals turned inward. Their restraint became dissent. Poets hid critique in metaphor. Where the empire prized loudness and performativity, the Ghazal's quietness became rebellion. In time, the Ottoman Ghazal turned spectacle against itself. Its ornate imagery echoed imperial splendor while revealing its emptiness. Navis' We Don't Need a Cup of Pleasure is a good example of critiquing empty worldly power. The poem rejects the cup of pleasure from the hand of this lowly world, a metaphor for imperial reward and fleeting privilege. Jemshid, the mythic king who once held divine authority, becomes a warning, his grandeur reduced to mortality. Even he drank that poison, undone by the same world he ruled. Against this fallen monarch stands Farhad, the humble stonecutter whose devotion turns labor into transcendence. Where Jamshid embodies power's corruption, Farhad represents steadfast love and self-effacing endurance. His struggle with the mountain is both literal and spiritual, a refusal to submit to worldly hierarchies. In the end, Navi turns to the pure-hearted Farhad as the quiet ire of the Ghazal's defiance, sometimes thankful for love and madness, sometimes crying out in complaint. Farhad embodies restraint amid spectacle, and in the courtly world of excess, humility and suffering became moral strength. Farhad's madness turns into virtue, a resistance to the empire's hollow grandeur and its fleeting pleasures. Nefis Kagithani Square is more radical in how it exemplifies the Ottoman Ghazal's transformation of public space into a stage of aesthetic and social play. Set in a popular leisure site of 17th century Istanbul, the poem examines imperial and elitist place of power in a place designed to see and to be seen. The speaker's attention to the crowd, to beautiful girls, and the mingling of high and low collapses hierarchies that ordinarily govern visibility and desire. The sacred and the profane overlap. The square is a corner of heaven, yet it teems with bodies, gestures, and laughter. In this scene, love and beauty are not abstract ideals but public acts of participation. The Sufi call for union is rejected, and its spiritual inwardness supplanted by collective embodied experience. The Ghazal resists the spatial discipline of both mosque and court, reclaiming the square as a space of sensual knowledge and mutual recognition. The poem turns Kagitani's revelry into a mirror of imperial excess. Nefi inserts himself as the laughingstock, out of place, and yet the only lucid voice in the crowd competing for attention. His weariness unmasks the violence of spectacle, where subjects are parodied and emptied of agency. Yet he weaponizes this visibility, revealing the empire's decay beneath its dazzling harmony. Under the Ottomans, the Ghazal shifted from private devotion to public spectacle. Within the empire's elaborate performances of power, poets turned love's ambiguity into a language of concealment and critique. Desire became a veil through which discontent could be spoken without direct confrontation. And in this kind of transformation, the Ghazal preserved its spirit of defiance. It survived empire by performing obedience while quietly undoing it from within, turning beauty and excess into instruments of resistance. In South Asia, the Ghazal evolved amid new fractures of language, empire, and faith. Persian, the Mughal tongue of power, contrasted with Urdu, a hybrid vernacular born in markets and camps, where cultural margins found voice through verse. Urdu's hybridity embodied resistance, turning exclusion into belonging. As Urdu absorbed the Ghazal, it bridged classes and faiths while remaining peripheral to Arabic authority. Under colonial rule, divisions deepened, yet the Urdu Ghazal endured as a form of longing and critique within the fractures of colonialism. Mir Tahimir's Really, I am now utterly weary and sick of it all captures the exhaustion of legibility in the late Mughal world under British ascendancy. His weariness is historical, the fatigue of a poet watching his language, watching his city collapse under colonial pressure. Expression becomes perilous, so Mir's plea, no more hostility, please, holds the exhaustion of one speaking to a world that no longer listens. His balance of confession and concealment becomes both survival in the midst of empire's slow suffocation. Because there is no trust, Mears offers also no redemption, sustaining the wound instead of healing it, saying, "For many years have I endured the drinking of my own blood." The wound, a popular symbol in the Ghazal, is used here to admit a long practiced intimacy with suffering that must remain unseen through a self devouring figure whose grief cannot be shared. And the speaker has no audience here, only the judgment of a public eager to set him straight and take him back into the fold to maintain a semblance of order. But Mir is unrelenting in his dissent, daring the system to do to me all that you can, exposing domination disguised as love. Beneath its refinement lies the claustrophobia of a poet trapped in a system that aestheticizes pain. In the end, he insists that goodness alone that remains. The poet's endurance becomes his final rebellion. He would much rather sustain the wound rather than allow power the comfort of closure. If Mir's Ghazal endures the wound in silence, Ghalib's turns that silence into deliberate revolt. Composed under British colonial rule that has disrupted traditional social hierarchies, even God's Paradise speaks from a world where transcendence is doubted because it presents yet another promise of salvation, masking dispossession. Ghalib's defiance emerges from within this violence, refusing consolation in a world remade by empire. Ghalib's weariness is historical as much as spiritual, the exhaustion of witnessing faith, language, and meaning conscripted into imperial order. He recasts Revelation as aesthetic play, stripping it of authority yet preserving its beauty, turning devotion into quiet defiance. Where mere imagined violence is an open wound, Ghalib sees it as light mounting rebellion against both religious and imperial authority. Images of illumination pervade, a sunburst, a votive lamp, sparks like little seeds, revealing how revolt is cultivated in the self. Unlike mere weary endurance, Ghalib performs mastery over ruin, making fragmentation a sign of intelligence rather than despair. So by saying, "I am a votive lamp no one ever lighted," Ghalib's speaker figures himself as a vessel built for devotion, yet unlit by the very systems that define worth. The lamp's unlit state resists completion, refusing to fulfill the purpose assigned to it by power. This refusal deepens as Ghalib moves from the personal to the collective, revealing a world reordered by British Empire. These images of death are not private griefs, but the ordinary condition of colonial life, famine, censorship, subjugation. The poem speaks from within a society vanishing under occupation. The revolt he tends, the lamp he withholds, unfold within a landscape disciplined by empire. Yet even here, Ghalib says it's okay for everything to crumble, rejecting the false refuge of imperial order. The Urdu Ghazal endures as the poetic consciousness of a fractured region, emerging from the crossroads of empire, language, and faith. It transformed hybridity into resistance and marginality into belonging. And even under colonial rule, as linguistic hierarchies ossified, the Ghazal preserved the plural critical imagination, bridging classes and religions while speaking from the edges of power. In its persistence, the Ghazal reminds us that beauty can survive dismemberment and that poetry can sustain a form of life within ruin. Partition's violence turned the poet's solitude into collective exile. In 1947, the division of British India displaced and killed millions as borders hardened by religion and language tore apart shared lives. Urdu, born from cultural mingling in Delhi and Lucknow, was caught in this rupture, erased from Indian institutions as Muslim, and elevated in Pakistan as a purified national ideal. Its plural histories were severed from public life. In this unmaking, the Ghazal became a vessel for what politics and faith could no longer hold. Its fragments mirrored scattered lives, its refusals echoed disillusionment, and the form endured, transforming grief and exile into a poetics of survival. Faiz Ahmad Faid's The Morning of Freedom, August 1947, takes a radical revision of the Ghazal in both form and topic, but still unmistakably carries the Ghazal sensibility of sustained longing and refusal. What Faiz inherits from the Ghazal is its structure of address and its capacity to convert unfulfilled desire into political consciousness. Here, the beloved is no longer a singular figure, but a collective, the nation itself, invoked as a dream deferred. The poem's voice emerges from the ruins of partition, speaking to those who had hoped, suffered, and struggled for freedom, only to find it stained and night-bitten and fractured. Independence arrives not as dawn, but as its aftermath, its promise dimmed by violence, displacement, and betrayal. Queering operates anew in refusal of the nation's triumphalist narrative. Just because the state declares freedom and liberation does not mean that it has arrived. And like the forlorn lover of the traditional ghazal, who understands that love will never be consummated, the speaker here also understands that whatever nation is supposedly finalized in this performative declaration of freedom is an outright betrayal. The poem echoes a counterpublic consensus of disappointment, transforming mourning into critique and turning the ghazal's affective intensity toward political failure. And just like the lover in the traditional ghazal who is unsettled by a love that will always be out of reach, the citizens of these new nations are reminded that the new Pakistan and India, configured after the declaration of partition, is not their final destination. This reminder lands without ceremony, speaking in exhaustion. The state's arrival has been named, but the speaker remains elsewhere, in another history and in another society, thinking about better ways to resolve this hunger for a better proposition for a country. And Nasir Kazmi's What Happened to Them embodies the post-partition Ghazal's transformation from personal lament to collective mourning. The poem's repeated question, what happened to them, enacts a litany of absence, naming not individuals, but a lost world of loved ones, friends, and communities all lost in the partition. Kazmi reworks the Ghazal's traditional longing for the beloved into a historical lament for community and continuity. The beloved here is collective, the people, the nation, the ordinary life extinguished by violence and displacement. And the Ghazal structure of repetition mirrors the condition of exile, circling loss without resolution, refusing closure. In place of divine or romantic fulfillment, the poem offers desolation, burnt buildings, empty houses, silence by the riverbank. Kazmi's tone is restrained yet piercing, embodying the Urdu ghazal's endurance amid fragmentation. What was once a form of intimate yearning becomes, after partition, a mode of historical witnessing, sustaining memory when all else has been erased. After partition, the ghazal ceased to mourn only the absent beloved. It became a vessel for modern ruin, forced migrations, erased homes, and betrayed freedoms. Modernity brought bloodshed instead of liberation, nationalism turned faith and language into weapons, and new nations refused to breathe. Yet in the ghazal, sorrow endures without surrendering to the state's illusions. Diasporic writers transformed the ghazal into a form of exile and resistance, translating its longing into languages like English, Bengal, Punjab, Spanish, and French. The beloved became the lost homeland, and each couplet a border crossing between languages and histories. By reworking the ghazal's mystical and erotic tropes, they exposed the fractures of translation, colonialism, and identity. In their hands, the ghazal became a global counterpublic form, rooted in displacement, yet fluent still in survival. Keki and Deruwala's partition ghazal transforms the classical form into a lament for modern displacement, showing how the ghazal becomes an apt vessel for diasporic consciousness. Written from the vantage of point of an Indian Parsi poet writing in English, recalling the wreckage of partition, the poem relocates the ghazal's traditional yearning for an absent beloved into a collective yearning for a lost homeland. The refrain, "This may pass muster and yet may not pass," captures the uncertainty of memory, the impossibility of closure that defines both exile and history. Among the many possible nuances to discuss about the poem, the invocation of Gandhi, Jinnah, Patel, and Nehru stands out as it exposes the patriarchal architecture of nationalism. These anchorites and ascetics presided over freedom's spire, their male visions of statehood leaving no space for tenderness or survival. Their names, once symbols of hope, become spectral presences, ghosts and forgotten tenants, haunting the poem's wrecked landscape. Through this, Daruwala critiques how nationalist leadership reproduced the hierarchies it claimed to dismantle, substituting the colonizer's authority with the paternal logic of founding fathers. Daruwala queers the patriarchy of nationalism by exposing how these men, once symbols of liberation, preside instead over fragmentation, their gestures of unity turning into acts of division. By invoking them through irony rather than reverence, the poem refuses the nation's paternal myth of coherence. And so, in the closing line, "The past you talk may not have been the past," Daruwala unsettles the gendered certainty on which nationalist memory rests. The Ghazal becomes the site of estrangement, where longing persists not for the homeland promised by men, but for one unclaimed by their power. Finally, and as we move towards a conclusion, it might be fitting to end with this poem by Sarah Ghazal Ali. It has the same title with the Daruwala poem, but it is interesting to see how the perspective changes considering Sarah Ghazal Ali is the one and only woman in our selection for the study. Her partition Ghazal is a diasporic reimagining of the Ghazal's central preoccupation with separation and belonging. Where classical Ghazals lament the distance from a beloved, Ali reconfigures longing into the condition of exile itself. The beloved here is the homeland, a once claimed land that buds a sudden country. Yet this blooming is violent. Each new country is born from the perforation of a body, from the act of partitioning that transforms intimacy into borders. The Ghazal's repetition and self-containment echo the recursive thief of diaspora. Each couplet returns to the wound, naming the fracture without healing it. The lyricism of the poem intensifies this haunting as we move through different forms of devastation, like the man chasing his lazy finger down a map, referencing the haphazard way in which the partition was enacted, leading to the contrasting brutality of nation making. Such juxtapositions queer the national narrative by exposing how its masculine rational order of borders and maps is rooted in violence. And this violence is continued through the depiction of other men and their complicitness in adjusting their lives to fit the grand narratives of the nation, like that of the grandfather who watched the chaos unfold literally from the walls, displaced from the center of life, reduced to a figure of memory or surveillance. The image of the partridge falling from its sky of no country deepens the sense of dislocation. The partridge, a bird often linked to longing in Urdu and Persian poetics, is deprived of its sky, its natural habitat, its freedom. So so to fall from a sky of no country is to fall from an absence and to be doubly exiled, first from home, and then from the very idea of having one. And what did the men do after partition? Instead of rectifying the problems of collective life, they fell back into old routines, silent and hateful, passing off that silence and hate to their wives and offspring while taking refuge in the peculiar heat of a woman's country. A discarnate country, a country with no body, presumably no territories and borders to own. Belonging is no longer anchored in soil or blood, but in the fluid, ungovernable space of empty geographies that are filled instead with the spectral intimacy of national laws, national histories, national religions, national languages. Um, Other forms of belonging, other forms of false belonging. And the grandmother is introduced as a figure triply displaced by marriage to a man whose identity is consumed by loss, by bearing the burden of responsibilities men can no longer confront, and by the falsity of collective systems that govern their lives, including the nation they inhabit. She's too young to tend a landless man, but she has to, as forced domesticity is the only escape for many women who had to go through the historical catastrophe of the partition. She nurtures a man who cannot be nurtured, someone whose very masculinity had been hollowed out by dispossession, and someone with no space behind bone for her, only his lost country. The space behind bone gestures to the heart, but the heart is already filled with the memory of the nation. He has internalized homeland as a wound and an obsession, leaving no room for intimacy. And the woman becomes a ghost within her own marriage, excluded not only from nationhood, but from affection itself. So the lost country becomes both literal and homeland, and the lost emotional terrain of women erased from the story of partition. And the poet inherits this violence that even if she finds herself away, angered, she reminds herself that this is the patriarchy at work, and that the men in her life would much rather sing the anthems of these so called new countries of the partition than to find their futures elsewhere where the wind might take them. What the Ghazals have taught me is that the intimacy of history is inseparable from its violence. And the poems we have looked at name what political discourse continuously disavows, that borders are carved through bodies, that the making of nations requires the unmaking of lives, that the Ghazal does not memorialize loss, it exposes the conditions that reproduce it. Masculinities collapse into cruelty, faith's translation into law, belonging's transformation into enclosure. What appears as private grief in a lot of these poems is the persistence of a political wound, and many of them refuse the sentimental closure that nationalist memory demands. In this sort of collective refusal, the Ghazal restores insurgency to feeling itself, reminding us that love, if it is to survive empire, nation, law, it must imagine new forms of relation, new vocabularies of care beyond the borders that made it impossible. So there, thank you.
Thank you so much, Joseph. Um, Now we will open our discussion with our faculty here on the Zoom and on Facebook also. So, do we have any questions from our faculty?
Good afternoon. Hello. Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Yeah. Congratulations, Joseph, for this masterful lecture. I enjoyed listening to it, and I'm actually very much reminded of the lecture by David Damrosch that I listened to in the International Comparative Literature Association fairly recently. Um, um, I am very much interested how this discussion of the Ghazal goes against racial and gender stereotypes, given the form and where it's coming from. So my question is actually, do you think, what I remember from Damrosch is that he says that we should all be translation activists, and it can be seen in your talk why translation is important. I was wondering if you feel that this same things that you talked about, for example, uh, queering and going against creating a counterpublic, etc. Does this also happen? Is this also what do you call this? Figuratively, or something that we can also apply, for example, when it comes to Philippine regional literature and translating Philippine regional literature? Is that also something that we can see counterpublics of? Thank you.
Um, Thank you for that question. Yes. I there are so many ways to sort of imagine the paradigms in which um, this kind of translation and comparative work offers itself into the specters of different types of um, meaning making in not only in poetry but in literary practice itself. For example, I'm curious as to how a lot of these ghazals, or at least my curiosity with it started when I was trying to trace and track how the Islamic faith shifted from the Middle East going into the Indian Ocean, into Southeast Asia, Indonesia, Malaysia, and eventually Mindanao in the Philippines, and what kinds of forms persisted. Um, I think it's important to keep on sort of asserting that the practice of literary histories is not something that is just chronological, but literary histories are also migrant. Literary histories also move, and that if we want a much more comprehensive idea of how literary histories have developed for example in a country like ours, we have to somehow let go um, some of the ideas and the very rigid structure that keeps on defining Philippine literature according to the colonial experience of Spain and the United States. Um, and so the study of the Ghazal allows us to recover a pre-colonial and also a transoceanic network of cultural exchange that connects us to the Middle East, and also to South Asia. Because along these routes traveled not only goods, as studies like Cesar Ajib Majul would have asserted, but there is also music, verse, and religion. And the Ghazal, transmitted as part of a broader Islamic aesthetic, represents this sort of deeper layer of connectivity that has been eclipsed by the Spanish American narrative of Philippine literary history. So by recognizing the Ghazal as part of this shared archive coming from the Indian Ocean, we reframe Philippine literature as one of many nodes in a long and complex circulation of poetic and spiritual forms across Asia. And this decenters Europe as the primary source of literary influence, and instead situates the archipelago within a regional continuum where Islam and also Hinduism traded, and poetry coexisted as dynamic forces. The Ghazal, I don't, I've been trying to look for versions of the Ghazal in Mindanao, but I haven't found any. But I did find a number of them in Malaysia and Indonesia. Unfortunately, the concept of the ghazal that has traveled there is still the conventional orthodox ghazal, still the love poem, encapsulated in music. And it's also interesting because some studies, although they're not really definitive and they're uncertain of this hypothesis, they do claim that the traveling of the ghazal towards Southeast Asia comes with a very strict mandate of censorship under Islamic religion. And so those things, those um, sort of exchanges, um, helps us recover a lot of submerged histories of contact that predate colonization and challenge the national literary canon's very insular orientation.